Thank you all for being here. I want to encourage you, please. You can walk in front of me, and you can find seats on this side of the room. You needn't stand over on the outskirts. I'm Tim DeRoche. I'm the director of programs at WorldOregon. Many of you know me because you see me every year doing this in, year out. This is my 15th year of doing this series, and one of the things that I love, as the president points out, is these are top of the fold, ripped from the headlines topics, and that's why we get together, because oftentimes we can't find the granularity, the truth, the complexity below the headline. And this is a great way for all of us to be empowered to see our own roles as the origins of the series proclaimed, that every citizen, a statesperson, it was statesmen back then, and so thanks for keeping this kind of people-powered democratization of foreign policy going. It is a key part of what WorldOregon does every year, and it is one of my very, very favorite things we do. Just as an aside to President Cudd's comments on Charlie White, this is Charlie White's copy of, before it was Great Decisions, it was called World Affairs Are Your Affairs. And Charlie White's name is in it, and it says, "Do not remove." So it's sort of like the tag on the mattress. I might be arrested later for having this. But this is from 1953, and in fact, Charlie White corrected me. For years, the Foreign Policy Association has said the series started in 1954 in Portland, Oregon, and he said, nope. And right inside it says 1953 right there. So I trust him as a vessel of truth. Anyway, as Derek noted, we are streaming this to senior living communities this year, and we're very, very excited about that. As always, I want to thank Portland State University's Office of Global Engagement and Innovation for being such an incredible partner for this series. If you missed one of our programs, they are on the WorldOregon YouTube channel. You can go there. There is a playlist of Great Decisions 2026. You can actually watch 10, 15 years worth of Great Decisions if you so desire. Also, if you missed the program we did yesterday with Robert Asadi from PCC on the protests in Iran, that is also up on our YouTube page. We love doing, well, we wish we didn't have to, but we love being able to do rapid response programs to changing events in the globe, and it helps connect all of us here out in the hinterlands of Oregon to everything that is going on. So because we are streaming and we are recording, when we get to Q&A, a couple things. Make sure you are asking a question, 30 seconds or less with a question mark at the end of it, and it needs to be on the mic. Otherwise, it doesn't get heard for the folks who are tuning in at home or in their car or wherever they are. Also, today's topic, as was noted, is an extremely timely situation, and we're going to be partnering this spring with the Portland Leave Friendship City Association that has a book group. And we've got a couple books that we're going to be part of. One is called Looking at Women, Looking at War, and it is Victoria Amelina, who was killed by a mortar blast a year or so ago in Ukraine. We'll be reading this. We'll be reading Andrei Lubka's War from the Rear. Very, very powerful stuff. We don't have dates yet, but stay tuned for those. We will include them in our e-news. If you're not signed up for our weekly e-news, worldoregon.org, scroll down, put your email in there, and you'll hear from me regularly. Anyway, also, Great Decisions books, $35 for you from Good Family today. We've got these available. We'll have them available throughout the series. If you want to, it's sort of like you can't follow the players without the program. You read the topic, you hear the speaker, and you're much more ready to engage in a question or a scrum or whatever suits you. So we've got them, and you should have them. Anyway, to today's program, very excited to welcome back Joshua Eastin. Joshua is a professor of political science here at the Hatfield School of Government. He teaches courses in international relations, environmental politics, and security studies. His research has addressed the causes and consequences of economic underdevelopment, the relationship between food insecurity and political violence, the formation and mobilization of paramilitary groups and other local security institutions. His work has appeared in journals such as Defense and Peace Economics, International Interactions, Terrorism and Political Violence, World Politics, and the list goes on. He is co-author of Greening China, The Benefits of Trade and Foreign Direct Investment, and we are lucky to have such smart people at Portland State University in our own backyard who can help us understand very, very difficult issues. So big hand for Joshua.
All right, greetings everybody. Gosh, it is just so incredibly gratifying to look out and see such a big audience. I will pretend that you all came here just to see me and not to hear about interesting things going on in the news. But as somebody who thinks about this a lot, it is incredibly gratifying to see such interest. It reminds us that international affairs is not just stuff that happens in other places. You know, it's something that affects us all. It's an object worthy of academic study, and it has a very strong and dedicated place in a university campus. So I really appreciate you all coming. Let's get right to it. So let me start with a simple observation that I think is easy to miss if we only follow this war, the war in Ukraine, through the headlines. You know, we usually talk about the war in Ukraine as a tragedy or as a crime or a humanitarian emergency, and it is certainly all of those things. But today I want to talk about it as something else too, as a constitutional moment for European security. Now, I don't mean constitutional in the written sense, okay? I mean it in a broader sense. A constitutional moment is when the basic rules of the game are in question. Long-standing assumptions become visible, and once they're visible, they become debatable. That's what this war has done. It has made visible the fragility of guarantees, the politics behind promises, and the power behind rules. And it's happening at the same time that the United States, the keystone of Europe's security for 75 years, is signaling that it plans to reduce its commitments to NATO. So the core question today isn't only what happens to Ukraine, it's what kind of Europe comes after this. With reduced U.S. support for NATO and Ukraine, Europe faces strategic uncertainty. What are America's stakes in NATO? What are Europe's strategic dilemmas? And what paths might Europe take from here? That's where we're going. Specifically, I want to discuss with you today the old European security model, so what it was, why it worked as long as it did. I want to talk about why Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, breaks that model, and why the U.S. response to that war is a signal that matters beyond Ukraine itself. We're going to talk about America's stakes, why the United States has cared about NATO historically, and what changes if it cares less. And we're going to talk about Europe's challenges and options. And I'm going to outline for you 3 plausible paths for the future, plus the nuclear question, which is buzzing underneath all of this. So for roughly 75 years, European security rested on the United States providing an overwhelming military power. It rested on NATO offering an institutional framework and a nuclear deterrence in the background as a final backstop. Now, that system did not eliminate conflict. Europe still saw violence. Think about the Yugoslavian wars in the 1990s. Think about acts of terrorism or the instability around Europe's periphery. But what it did do was suppress the most dangerous kinds of competition, major interstate war among European powers, as well as opportunistic border revisionism. It made territorial conquest irrational. It made war among major European powers irrational. And it made nuclear proliferation across Europe for decades largely irrational. And it did that not only by moral persuasion, but by structuring incentives. If you were a European state after World War II, you didn't need your own nuclear deterrent because the American guarantee existed. You didn't need to arm against your neighbors because NATO stabilized those relationships. That's one reason people talk about a long peace. It wasn't that the Europeans after World War II magically became more peaceful. It's that the security architecture defined what was worth doing and not doing. This architecture wasn't just military. It also supported a broader rules-based order that underwrote trade, investment, and prosperity, something that the Europeans experienced directly and that the Americans benefited from tremendously. So when people ask today, why does NATO matter? One answer is that it helped remove the structural incentives for a repeat of Europe's darkest days. Now keep that in mind, because Ukraine and the Ukrainian war is where this structure meets a stress test. Here's the blunt truth that Ukraine forces us to confront. Deterrence is selective. Deterrence depends on credibility. Credibility depends on commitments. Commitments, in this case, depend on membership. Ukraine was not a NATO member, so it was always in a different category. And this creates what strategists call a gray zone, a space where rules are ambiguous, commitments are unclear, and the future orientation of a country is contested. Gray zones are unstable. They attract pressure. If you're a revisionist power, like Russia, gray zones are where you probe. They're where you test, where you push, where you look for the limits. And if you meet no resistance, you push further. So Ukraine is really a structural fault line. This brings us to something crucial: security guarantees. At their core, security guarantees are political commitments. And political commitments can weaken. They can be reinterpreted. They can be deprioritized. And this is the part that matters for us now, they can be made to feel uncertain even before they formally change. This leads us to the real significance of the U.S. response to the war in Ukraine. Because what Washington does and what it doesn't do isn't only about Ukraine. It's a signal that every European capital reads as evidence about the future reliability of the U.S. guarantee. Let me put this as plainly as I can. For 75 years, the United States has been the central pillar of European security. It has been the backstop that made everyone else's calculations simpler. And here's the part that people often underestimate. Security isn't just about weapons, it's about expectations. It's about whether you think help will arrive in time. It's about whether you believe commitments will be honored, whether you think allies will still be there when risks become real. So when a major war breaks out on NATO's frontier against a nuclear-armed power, America's behavior becomes not just a signal to Moscow, but to Berlin and Warsaw and Paris and Tallinn and Helsinki and Stockholm, everyone, even Beijing. Now, the U.S. response thus far has been described as deliberate and constrained, as trying to do multiple things at once, as trying to help Ukraine survive, to avoid direct war with Russia, to manage escalation, to keep NATO unified, and to prevent the conflict from expanding. And this is a very difficult balancing act. But it comes with a strategic downside. When you try to do too many things at once, you can send mixed signals. And mixed signals are poison for deterrence. Because deterrence is about what other actors believe you will do next time, not just what you say today. So Europe watches, and it draws conclusions. And the conclusions many European leaders are drawing are unsettling. U.S. support can be enormous, but it's not unconditional. American politics can swing sharply from one election to the next. U.S. strategic attention is increasingly being pulled towards Asia. And even when American leaders want to act, domestic constraints also matter. If you're sitting in a European capital right now, and you believe that U.S. support for NATO may be less predictable or more conditional, then you start planning around worst cases. not because you want the worst cases, but because responsible security planning always assumes that good intentions can fail. So that's a major question for us today. If the American pillar is less reliable, what does Europe do? But before we get to Europe's options, we also need to consider something else, America's stakes. It's easy, especially in US domestic politics, to talk about NATO as if it were some sort of charity organization. Historically, it has not been, okay? The oldest strategic logic for the United States' role in NATO is the simplest. The US has long tried to prevent any single hostile power from dominating the European continent because a dominant power in Europe can set rules, control markets, coerce neighbors, and project influence outward. Europe is one of the world's largest economic zones. If it becomes politically coerced or strategically unstable, that has major global ripple effects. So NATO is not only about defending Europe, it's about shaping the distribution of power in a region that has historically, at least, been a cockpit for global insecurity and conflict. But there's also a less visible but still critically important stake, credibility. If the United States signals that its commitments are optional, conditional, or easily reversible, that doesn't only affect Europe. It affects how allies and adversaries interpret US promises everywhere. Even if you don't believe that credibility is perfectly transferable from one region to another, it's obvious that allies watch each other. They learn from each other's experience. So US credibility in Europe is part of US power globally. There's also a budgetary logic. A stable deterrent posture can be expensive. You know, historically, I think the United States spends around 7% of its GDP on defense spending. But it can be a lot cheaper than fighting a major war or managing repeated crises. Think of it like insurance. Nobody likes paying premiums, but the alternative, paying after the house burns down, is worse. And finally, there's an issue that doesn't get nearly enough attention, nuclear proliferation. For decades, part of what NATO did was reduce the incentives for allies to pursue their own nuclear weapons. If the American umbrella suddenly looks unreliable, you can imagine more voices in Europe asking, do we need our own ultimate guarantee? If the US exits, are French nukes a significant deterrent? Are the French even willing to extend that deterrent? How secure might you feel if you're a small border country like Lithuania or Estonia or even Finland? And once that question becomes politically normalized, it becomes very difficult to put back in the box. So paradoxically, a US pullback could, if mishandled, also increase long-term nuclear risk. Now, I want you to hold on to this thought because we're going to come back to it. Now, at this point, some people say, fine. If US support becomes less reliable, Europe should just take care of itself. And in principle, Europe is wealthy. It's certainly wealthy enough to do more, and probably much more than it's currently doing. But here's the catch. European dependence on the United States is not only just political, it's also material. It's logistics, it's intelligence, it's surveillance, it's airlift, it's command and control. During the Afghanistan withdrawal in 2021, for example, many European countries discovered that they could not even evacuate their own citizens at scale without American help because they lacked lift capacity, logistics systems, and the command architecture for rapid operations. This isn't an insult, it's a design outcome. European militaries were built to plug into an American-led system. They were not built to replace it. And it shows up everywhere. It shows up in how they buy weapons, how they train, and what kind of operations they can do independently. This brings us to Europe's strategic dilemmas. And the simplest way to summarize those dilemmas is this. Europe wants more security, Europe wants more autonomy, Europe wants to avoid escalation, and Europe wants to preserve unity. But it cannot maximize all four at the same time. So choices are coming. So let me now shift from America's stakes to Europe's problems. Because if US support becomes less predictable, Europe isn't simply just left alone. It's pushed into a new strategic environment where it has to do three things at once. It has to deter Russia credibly in the near term. It has to rebuild capacity for the medium term. And it has to maintain political unity across a very diverse continent in the long term. This is a tall order. And here's a key point. Europe's challenge is not that it lacks money or intelligence. It's that it faces a series of genuine trade-offs where improving one dimension of security makes another dimension harder. When the US was the dominant NATO player, many of these problems were resolved. Without that leadership, these challenges reemerge. I'm going to walk through some of these dilemmas. Then I'm going to show you how they produce different plausible paths for Europe, each with its own costs and risks. The first trade-off concerns wealth versus readiness. It's true that Europe has enormous economic strength, but modern deterrence does not run on GDP totals. It runs on readiness. Units that can move, sustain, and fight quickly with sufficient munitions, air defense, and command integration. This is where Europe's post-Cold War security model shows its limits. Europe built a defense posture that was optimized for peace and efficiency, not for prolonged, high-intensity war. Many states reduced stockpiles, they shrank forces, they treated industrial capacity as something they could turn off and on when needed. The war in Ukraine refutes this assumption. High-intensity war consumes ammunition, it consumes air defense interceptors, it consumes drones, it consumes repair capacity, all at paces that peacetime systems struggle to match. So even if Europe decides right now, today, to build the kind of forward defense posture that could truly blunt Russian pressure on its eastern flank, there's an explicit time problem. A credible posture, comparable in scope and ambition to Cold War US deployments would likely take years to establish given industrial and manpower constraints. So this trade-off is temporal. It may have the resources to build a stronger deterrent, but it does not have enough time in the short term to build it. The second trade-off also concerns time, but this time as it relates to integration. After 2022, European states began to rearm, and understandably, they prioritized speed. When you've transferred equipment to Ukraine and your inventories are thin, your instinct is to restock quickly. But fast procurement can lock in long-term fragmentation. Just as one example, Poland chose to order tanks from the United States and South Korea rather than to wait for a long-term Franco-German tank project to develop. But major weapon systems are decades-long commitments. When countries buy different kinds of kits, they lock in separate training, separate maintenance, separate supply chains, separate operational concepts. All of this cements fragmentation. This is a basic trade-off. Rearm fast, and you risk buying whatever is available, even if it deepens Europe's interoperability problems. Rearm together, and you risk moving too slowly for the current security environment. The EU is trying to push integration through the EU, not NATO, is trying to push integration through funding and incentives in order to reduce fragmentation and promote this interoperability. But the political economy is really hard. Defense procurement is one of the most sovereignty-sensitive domains in Europe. So this isn't only a management issue, it's a strategic one. Fragmentation weakens deterrence because it reduces Europe's ability to fight as a coherent system. The third challenge is leadership. Every European leader can say, Europe must do more. The United States can say the same thing. The hard part is deciding who decides. It's deciding who pays, and it's deciding who takes the lead. European security cooperation tends to break down when decisions require unanimity or when different threat perceptions collide. If the EU common foreign and security policy can be hijacked by the veto power of a single member state, such as Hungary's repeated veto threats on Ukraine-related issues, then unanimity-based systems are problematic from a security standpoint. So Europe faces an organizational dilemma. If they try to do everything through formal EU machinery, it risks paralysis. If it bypasses the EU and relies on coalitions, it may gain speed, but it will lose legitimacy and cohesion. Now, there is a potential compromise, a European coalition of the willing, as it were, that could be built around states that are already coordinating military support for Ukraine. And it could use this as a practical foundation for a more capable security arrangement. But at this point, no such arrangement has yet emerged. And what is clear is that Europe is going to need flexible geometry. So different groups doing different things, because a single all-European solution may not be politically feasible. Deterrence is also a challenge and a trade-off. It requires signaling. But signaling can look like provocation, especially in an environment where Russia uses fear, ambiguity, and nuclear threats to manipulate risk perception. Europe needs to deter in a way that is credible and controlled. Credible enough that Russia believes it cannot win through pressure or limited incursions. Controlled enough that Europe doesn't stumble into escalation through miscalculation. This is why the question of forward deployments, of training missions, of long-term security commitments for Ukraine is also sensitive. These are deterrence tools, but they are also escalatory or potentially escalatory in nature, such that Russia can use them to exploit. Now, finally, we come to one of the most politically charged and challenging of the trade-offs. Europe's states do not experience external threats, such as that posed by Russia, equally. Frontline states, so think here Baltic states, parts of Eastern Europe, treat Russia as an existential threat, understandably. Others weigh different priorities: domestic budgets, migration pressures, trade relationships, political polarization, constitutional neutrality constraints, okay? So we don't need to think about Europe as a single strategic actor. It's a coalition of states that must constantly negotiate a common line. This matters because deterrence is time sensitive and negotiations are slow. Now let's combine these dilemmas and trade-offs together to consider paths for Europe's future. These paths aren't going to tell us what will happen, but they represent some most likely scenarios. The first path is amended status quo, a repaired, US-anchored NATO. In this future, NATO remains central and the United States remains deeply engaged, maybe not in exactly the same way or at exactly the same intensity as before, but still as a cornerstone. Europe increases defense spending and readiness, but does not attempt to build a fully autonomous strategic architecture. Why is this path attractive? Because it preserves what's already worked: the alliance framework, integrated planning, and a US role that stabilizes European coordination problems. And it preserves the flexibility embedded in Article 5 that states that each ally must respond to an attack on a member state, but retains some discretion over what type of response is necessary. A design feature that keeps the commitment politically sustainable across different governments and publics. Why is this path fragile? Because it places Europe's strategic baseline in the hands of American domestic politics, which seem far from stable at the current moment. And I don't think that that is necessarily a controversial view. So this means that European deterrence becomes in part an object of American electoral uncertainty. Historically, this has not been a problem, but the stakes are changing. The politics are changing. The international system is changing, and U.S. political preferences with regard to Europe may be changing as well. This is the path of least institutional disruption, but it's also a path that can fail abruptly and catastrophically if United States politics shift. Second, we can consider what I would call a Europeanization path. A European-led security order inside or alongside a NATO coalition of some sort. In this future, Europe builds capacity and coordination to become the primary manager of conventional deterrence on the continent, with NATO either evolving into a more European-led alliance or coexisting with European coalitions and EU defense initiatives. Now, as I mentioned previously, this arrangement may need to be organized around what we would call a coalition of the willing. So France, maybe the UK, that's a big question. Germany, Poland, the Nordics and Baltics, nations which are already coordinating Ukrainian support, rather than waiting for all 27 EU members to align and sign on. But a major question here again is who will lead? Roles traditionally held by Americans, such as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, would become central leadership questions, and how they break down is unclear. Now, why is this path hard? Because it requires Europe to solve multiple problems simultaneously. Industrial integration, so Europe can produce at scale. Operational integration, so forces can fight together. And political integration, so decisions can be made quickly. And it requires real money, not just meeting the NATO 2% guideline, which has always been partly symbolic, but spending in ways that actually close capability gaps and build production. Now, this path is possible, but it's not instantaneous. The third path represents a drift towards spheres of influence. This is the most dangerous path. It's also the easiest to stumble into because it does not require a single dramatic decision or plan. It requires inertia. In this future, Europe's response remains fragmented, slow, and uneven. Ukraine becomes what we might call a semi-frozen front. Russia continues to apply pressure through hybrid operations, through political interference, coercive diplomacy, and calibrated military threats. And over time, the principle that borders are not revised by force weakens through practical acceptance. The strategic danger here isn't that Europe gives up. It's that it becomes unable to act with the speed and unity required, and Russia learns that incremental gains are feasible. This is where our earlier dilemmas or trade-offs converge. Readiness gaps create vulnerability windows. Fragmentation makes coordination slower. Unanimity rules create veto points, and dependence makes Europe unsure what it can do alone. This is the world in which Europe's security becomes progressively more conditional, and where small states hedge, arm, and doubt the durability of commitments. Now, each of these paths have different requirements, but all three share one very uncomfortable truth. Under reduced United States support, Europe's security becomes more contingent, and contingency raises a fundamental and overarching question, the nuclear question, in a literal sense. Because when conventional deterrence is uncertain, and when adversaries believe that they can manipulate escalation risk, nuclear signaling becomes more salient. The nuclear question today is why we need to consider not only defense spending and European autonomy, but the deeper layer, the nuclear layer, the endgame problem in Ukraine, and the kinds of institutional commitments that Europe can credibly make when American support is less assured. I also want to connect the nuclear layer to something else that tends to get overlooked in public debate. The fact that how wars end shapes the next security order. In other words, the way the Ukraine war is stabilized, whether through victory, armistice, freeze, or collapse, is going to set the template for deterrence in Europe for the next generation. So we need to discuss why the nuclear question is back and why it's not just France can handle it or France and Britain can handle it, why the end of the war matters as much as the fighting, and a concrete set of European responses that are plausible under reduced US support. For most of the post-war era, Europe has lived under what people call the American nuclear umbrella. The idea that US nuclear forces ultimately backstop NATO's collective defense commitment. That umbrella did two things at once. It discouraged proliferation among US allies because they didn't need their own nuclear weapons. It also centralized the ultimate nuclear risk and decision-making in a single actor, the United States. So in this sense, Europe didn't eliminate nuclear weapons, it outsourced them. And if US commitments weaken, even if only in perception, Europe doesn't get to keep outsourcing. Now here's the uncomfortable part. Europe basically wants to do three things at the same time. It wants to signal credible deterrence against Russia. It wants to maintain strategic stability, meaning fewer incentives for anyone to go first with nuclear use. And it wants to maintain non-proliferation, keeping new European states from acquiring nuclear weapons. The challenge here is that it's difficult to maximize all three. Pick any two, and the third gets worse. If Europe prioritizes stability and non-proliferation, so keeping nuclear weapons limited to France, or maybe France and the UK, with restrained doctrines, then deterrence on the front line can look less credible because Russia retains advantages at certain sub-strategic nuclear levels and might gamble on coercion. Threats have already been made. If Europe prioritizes deterrence while retaining non-proliferation, meaning France and UK do extend a credible deterrence eastward, then it likely needs doctrinal changes and potentially more diverse or flexible capabilities, which increases escalation risk and which may be politically hard to sustain domestically. If Europe prioritizes deterrence and stability without the US backstop, one brutal solution is wider proliferation in Eastern Europe. This option also risks shredding the non-proliferation treaty and creating a dangerous transition period where Russia might have incentives to prevent new nuclear forces from emerging. So the nuclear question here isn't, do we like nuclear weapons? Nobody likes them. The question is, who bears the nuclear risk and how is that nuclear risk managed? And if US reliability is questioned, then Europe must answer these questions in some form. Now, it's tempting, again, to say, well, France and Britain are nuclear powers, problem solved. But extended deterrence isn't automatic. It depends on credibility. Credibility is not just capability. It's the plausibility that leaders would accept catastrophic risk on behalf of others. This is why Charles de Gaulle's famous skepticism during the Cold War still resonates today. Would the US trade New York for Paris? And in a post-American scenario, you'd hear the same question reframed. Would France trade Paris for Vilnius, or Sofia, or Helsinki, or even Warsaw? These are questions that will have to be answered credibly. And that immediately brings us to the second issue, how the war ends. War endings are blueprints. There's a way to see the Ukraine war that goes beyond the battlefield. The war is a contest over territory and sovereignty, yes, but it's also a contest over a broader rule. Does aggression pay, especially under the nuclear shadow? The most dangerous precedent is not that Russia invades Ukraine. The most dangerous precedent is Russia invades, suffers costs, but still ends up with a settlement that proves you can revise borders through force as long as you can deter escalation. That's what makes ceasefires and negotiated endings so tricky here. Unfortunately, promises that are not credible don't deter, and they may be worth less than nothing because they invite miscalculation. Providing NATO-style pledges for Ukraine or stationing troops can be perceived as bluffs if allies have repeatedly refused direct intervention, meaning Russia won't believe the promise. So what's the alternative? Well, one alternative would be to create a genuinely meaningful mechanical guarantee, something close to an insurance policy or a pre-committed snapback solution, such as sanctions or financial support and accelerated military aid that triggers automatically if Russia violates a ceasefire. Now notice what's happening here. The solution is not to pretend that Europe will do what it has not done. It is to institutionalize what Europe and the US have already shown they can do, but to make it faster, less discretionary, and harder to sabotage politically. Credible deterrence under certain conditions requires 4 elements: clear triggers, fast decision-making timelines, pre-positioned stockpiles and training capacity, and domestic legal codification. So politicians can't easily forget commitments when attention shifts. Now zoom out. Why does this matter for European security? Because whatever mechanism stabilizes Ukraine becomes a test case for the rest of Europe. If the mechanism is credible, it strengthens deterrence. If it's squishy or slow or discretionary, it teaches Moscow and every other actor watching that European security guarantees are negotiable. So the endgame is not a footnote, it's a blueprint. Now let's get practical. If US involvement is reduced, Europe will face a transition period where its ambitions outpace its capabilities. And this transition period is where danger concentrates. For example, if US assets in Europe decline before European substitutes are in place, then Russia may be tempted to probe, especially through hybrid actions, and possibly even limited territorial seizures. Seizures paired with coercion, with nuclear threats, in order to force NATO to accept fates accompli. In this scenario, the hope is that a US drawdown isn't casual but careful and coordinated with explicit identification of which capabilities are being withdrawn so Europeans can replace them in real time. In their turn, the Europeans would need to close the enabler gaps, so intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, logistics, readiness, munitions, command integration. And this is where US support has been most decisive and where European autonomy has been most constrained. Europeans would also need to build credible automaticity. Did I say that right? Automaticity, yes, into commitments. Europe struggles with slow consensus. So one of the most powerful design moves is to shift from an ad hoc crisis bargaining model to pre-committed triggers, especially for sanctioning, financing, and military supply. Third, Europeans will need to describe what European nuclear responsibility means. And this is the deepest political lift, and Europe may try to postpone it. Unfortunately, there is no path that avoids painful trade-offs, and avoiding decisions doesn't make the problem go away. It only makes it more dangerous if the United States shift is abrupt. So Europe will likely move gradually towards some combination of clearer political signaling about French and British roles, deeper consultation mechanisms, shared financing debates, and at the very least, some contingency planning. It won't be a dramatic announcement. It will look like incremental institutional change until suddenly it doesn't. So when people ask, what does the Ukraine war mean for European security? They often mean, how much territory will change hands? Who wins? But the deeper meaning is about institutional credibility under the nuclear shadow. Can Europe deter coercion without always leaning on America? Can it build commitments that are fast enough to matter? Can it manage the nuclear question without triggering proliferation or instability? And can it prevent a world where borders become negotiable again? And that in turn brings us back to America's stakes, because the future of European security is not just Europe's problem. The United States has a deep strategic interest in Europe because instability there never stays regional. Historically, European breakdowns have pulled in the US into far more dangerous and costly conflicts. Alliances like NATO are tools for organizing power in advance, so crises do not spiral. Europe, meanwhile, is unlikely to choose a single clean path forward. It's likely to pursue a hybrid strategy, trying to keep NATO strong, build greater autonomy, and avoid drift toward spheres of influence all at once. This can work, but only if it's guided. If Europe merely drifts, hesitation and fragmentation will invite coercion. The Ukraine war is teaching the world that nuclear weapons, trade, and international law do not prevent war. They only shape it. What actually prevents war is credible, organized collective resistance. The way this war ends will teach future aggressors what is possible and what it's not. So at this core, this moment poses a deeper choice. Do we want a world organized by institutions and rules, or one organized by raw power and constant renegotiation through fear? Institutions are slow and imperfect, but they prevent catastrophes that we never see. Power politics is simpler, but it's dangerously unstable. This war is not just about Ukraine, it's about whether security in Europe remains collective and rule-based, or whether borders once again becomes negotiable through violence, and that choice will shape the next generation. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. We've got just a little bit of time for questions. So this brings up, we're really standing with two poles. We've got the one of moral responsibility, of protecting sovereignty and democracy, and an instinct toward transactional strategic prudence of some sort. Are these mutually exclusive? Are they a Mobius strip? And how hopeful are you that the Europeans can convince the U.S. of the strategic importance of stabilizing what could happen in Europe?
So the first question, are these poles mutually exclusive? Absolutely not. And in fact, I don't even think you really need the moral restraint argument, because when you talk about things like rules and commitments and protection of property rights and recognition of sovereignty, yes, we can consider these things as moral, perhaps, but they also create a system that enables incredible prosperity and economic growth. The post-war period has been one of tremendous gains in wealth, in scientific research and development, in food supplies, in productivity, in technological development. And it's in part because NATO and the United States and the United Nations have created a durable, international rules-based order that allows for those sorts of things to happen. So I don't think we even need to think about morality. I mean, it's important, certainly, but it's also about just basic incentives. So yes, I absolutely think those things are not only are they not mutually exclusive, but they overlap. Can the Europeans convince the United States that NATO is worth saving in time? That is a question that, unfortunately, is very difficult to answer. One of the main challenges in answering that question is the centralization of power in the United States government, in the executive branch, and increasingly in the hands of someone who is not the most predictable of individuals. So can the Europeans convince? At its heart, I like to think, I like to think that Donald Trump is a transactionalist. He's a businessman. I think, and maybe some of his behavior over the course of the last day or two, if you've been following this Greenland issue, can sort of speak to this, is that, yes, we'll hear, Iceland or Greenland, right? Is that yes, when push comes to shove and events are made crystal clear and costs are made crystal clear, then the president tends to come around to what seemed to be the initial starting point to begin with. But whether or not that's going to be true going into the future, it's very difficult to say. Political paralysis is challenging and it's problematic for many reasons, but prediction is one of them.
Very much appreciate the breadth and depth of your analysis. You approach the question very well, assuming Europe acting as a rational player, the U.S. far less so, but still rational. I guess that my question is, what is the attitude of the reality of Russia as a threat post-Putin? I mean, this is I don't have the impression of this as Hitler and Germany with the people behind him after the devastation of the 20s, blah, blah, blah. But this seems to be Putin's war. Doesn't seem to be Russia's war, and Putin's gone. The interest in Ukraine is not anti-Nazi anymore, and the energy relationship reestablishes itself. It just, if you could speak to that feasibility.
Yes. Well, I think the first thing I would say is that sometimes the motives and capabilities that present themselves at the beginning of the conflict change fundamentally throughout the course of the conflict. It's not clear whether that's the case here, at least regarding motives, but one thing that has changed fundamentally over the course of this conflict is, Russia's battle capabilities and its readiness to fight a modern war using modern technology. And that's something that it's gained a lot of experience doing over the course of the past few years in learning how to fight in new ways. So that in and of itself creates a threat because, it's been shown that it can work. Right? Maybe not in a really rapid and successful way, but in a grinding and costly way. Current cost estimates suggest that that Russia could probably sustain the Ukrainian war at current levels for at least 2 or 3 more years. These estimates vary, but I think about 2 years is a pretty safe bet. Ukraine's ability to sustain this war is entirely conditional on the aid that it receives from its allied partners. So if that aid is cut off, that ends, Putin gets what he wants, or at least some portion of it, and the negotiated peace that results would look, very Russia tilted. What that means for the future, again, it all speaks to credibility and signaling. I don't think that the most dangerous threat is a land army crossing over a border into a country like we saw with Europe. I don't think that's the most dangerous threat for some other European states. But what I can see as a dangerous threat is continued low-level sort of gray zone pressure that picks at individual European states and the politics within them such that it reforms the politics and institutions in states, probably states that used to lie within the Soviet sphere of influence, in ways that dramatically favor Russia and that create a lot of instability for Europe. And that's just a guess. I mean, again, it's hard to predict what individuals want, particularly when they have so much power and control over their own countries.
Is Russia still revanchist without Putin?
That's a big question. One of the biggest challenges Russia has right now is in leadership succession. And frankly, we have no idea how that's going to work. Yeah.
So as a betting man, Zelensky came out and said yesterday that he feels like he's watching Groundhog's Day. But came out of a meeting with essentially some post-conflict security guarantees. If you're a betting man, where do you see this going, and are you hopeful that it's within sight?
So the security guarantees are great in the sense that they show that European, American, and Ukrainian interests are starting to align. They do not address the other actor in the conflict, Russia. So it's not clear. I mean, if we take Putin at his rhetoric, Russia's not buying any of this. And it's not clear that they're going to do much of anything in terms of pushing a solution to actually, be signed off and to harden into a reality. Russia has been very clear. It's not going to accept troops on Ukrainian soil. It's not going to accept a Ukrainian military without significant limits. It's not going to accept some sort of retrenchment or withdrawal in the areas in which it's now claiming. And these are sort of indivisible stakes. So I think right now, the end is still highly unpredictable, but it's just a question of time. And I think both sides are buying time. And that's ultimately what's probably going to determine is who wears out first.
Great. Thanks so much. We are at time. Big hand for Joshua Eastin. Our sign falling off is no indicator of global instability. Don't worry about it. Join us next week. We're going to be looking at tariffs and the global economy, and then following that, the next week, the author of the article on tariffs in the Great Decisions book will be joining us online for a talk on shaken and stirred, the global economy in 2026. So we'll see you next week. Be safe, be well, and thanks for being here.